For over a century, some of the world's most powerful institutions have wrestled with a single fear: not war, not disease, too many people. Behind closed doors and beneath layers of policy, programs have been launched to reduce birth rates, not always through education or choice, but through silence, sterilizations, coercive family planning, selective policies targeting those deemed a burden. It was called progress, but for millions it meant something else entirely: the quiet end of a bloodline. Today, these same ideas are repackaged in sleek language: climate solutions, public health, sustainable futures. But the core question remains unchanged: who gets to exist and who doesn't? This is the disturbing, often forgotten history of population control, and why it might not be history at all. Chapter 1. The roots of the idea. Malthus and the useless poor. Before labs and laws, before clinics and quotas, population control was a theory, a cold equation on paper, and a deeply unsettling belief. In 1798, Reverend Thomas Malthus, an English cleric and political economist, published a now infamous book, an essay on the principle of population. His argument was simple and disturbing. While food grows slowly, people multiply rapidly. And if left unchecked, he warned, the lower classes would reproduce society into ruin. Malthus wasn't calling for mass violence, but he did suggest that famine, war, and disease were necessary correctives, natural ways to keep the poor from overwhelming the system. A man who is born into a world already possessed has no claim of right to the smallest portion of food. Thomas Malthus. This was more than theory. It was a justification for inaction, a cold permission slip to ignore suffering. Malthusian logic becomes policy. By the 1800s, Malthusian thinking had spread like wildfire through Britain's ruling class. Why build schools for the poor? Why feed the hungry? Why intervene in slums? If hardship was nature's way of keeping populations in check, then compassion wasn't noble. It was dangerous. The British Poor Laws were rewritten to reflect this view. Workhouses were created, grim institutions where the impoverished were sent to toil, often separated from spouses and children. Some were denied treatment, housing, or food. These weren't accidents. They were part of a belief system that poverty was not a problem to solve, but a symptom of too many lives. The foundation of a new ideology. Malthus didn't advocate for violence, but his work laid the intellectual groundwork for something worse. A worldview where people, especially the poor, weren't seen as individuals with potential, but as statistics in need of reduction. Charity became counterproductive, aid became interference, and human suffering became math. The most dangerous idea in the world. What began as a theory became an excuse. What began as economic logic evolved into population politics, and soon full-blown ideology. The idea that certain people should not reproduce, that the world would be better with fewer of them. This idea didn't die with Malthus. It mutated. It got dressed up in lab coats and scientific journals, and it was waiting quietly for the right technology to bring it to life. Chapter 2. The birth of eugenics, the science of human culling. Malthus may have planted the seed, but by the late 1800s, that seed had grown into something far more calculated and far more dangerous. A new idea was rising in scientific circles, not just reducing the poor, but engineering humanity itself. Its name was eugenics, and it promised a better world at a cost. A better breed of human. The term was coined by Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin. Inspired by natural selection, Galton believed society should actively guide who gets to reproduce and who doesn't. His vision, the wealthy and educated, encouraged to have more children. The poor, disabled, or morally weak, discouraged or outright stopped. This wasn't fringe science. It was celebrated in universities, discussed in parliament, and championed by powerful philanthropists. By the early 20th century, eugenics societies had formed across the UK, US, Germany, and Scandinavia. The goal? To refine humanity like livestock, deciding who doesn't belong. So who was considered unfit? Those with mental illness, people with physical disabilities, immigrants, single mothers, alcoholics, anyone considered socially degenerate or genetically inferior. This was not just theoretical. Governments began implementing policies. In 1907, Indiana passed the first US law allowing forced sterilization of those labeled unfit. By the 1930s, over 30 states had followed. Some sterilizations were performed under anesthesia. Others happened during unrelated surgeries. Some victims never found out until years later when they tried and failed to have children. The case of Carrie Buck. One of the most chilling cases was that of Carrie Buck, a teenage girl institutionalized in Virginia after becoming pregnant, the result of abuse by her foster cousin. Authorities declared her feeble-minded. Her mother was also institutionalized, her infant daughter assessed as likely defective. That was enough. In 1927, the US Supreme Court upheld Virginia's decision to sterilize Carrie. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. That ruling opened the door for tens of thousands of forced sterilizations across America, all deemed legal and in the public interest. The international spread. The US wasn't alone. In Sweden, state-sponsored sterilizations continued until the 1970s. In Canada, indigenous women were disproportionately targeted. In the UK, leading thinkers publicly praised eugenics well into the 1930s. The programs were often backed by major philanthropic foundations, some of which still exist today under different missions. At the time, their funding supported lectures, sterilization campaigns, and global conferences on population improvement. A global ethos in disguise, eugenics wasn't sold as cruelty. It was sold as compassion. Pamphlets spoke of helping the mentally deficient. Medical boards claimed to be protecting families, but the result was always the same. Reproductive futures ended without consent. Entire groups labeled as burdens. Children born into poverty seen not as lives, but as liabilities. A dangerous blueprint. One government watched these policies closely. One leader read American eugenics textbooks and saw potential. Germany. In the next chapter, we'll see what happens when this ideology of better breeding leaves the lab and becomes a national policy. Chapter 3, America's sterilization machine, the quiet erasure. By the early 20th century, the United States had taken eugenics from theory to institutional reality. There were no concentration camps, no shock headlines, no mass graves, just clean paperwork, surgical gloves, and quiet, irreversible decisions made on behalf of people who never gave consent. Legalized sterilization. The first state to act was Indiana in 1907, passing a law allowing forced sterilization of people deemed unfit to reproduce. Over the next few decades, more than 30 US states followed, all under the banner of public health and social improvement. Targets included people with mental illness or cognitive disabilities, poor and homeless individuals, single mothers, juvenile delinquents, and increasingly, people of color. The justification: that society would be better off if fewer children were born into hardship. How it was done. The procedures varied. Some victims were sedated during childbirth or unrelated surgeries and sterilized without their knowledge. Others were coerced into signing consent forms under pressure or false pretenses. Facilities often had quotas, records were kept, but families were rarely informed. It wasn't a fringe operation, it was policy. By the 1970s, over 60,000 sterilizations had been carried out across the US, and those are just the documented cases. Disproportionate impact. These programs did not affect all Americans equally. Black women were disproportionately targeted, especially in the South. Latina women in California were sterilized in public hospitals, sometimes just minutes after childbirth. Indigenous women under the care of Indian Health Services were sterilized at rates far beyond the national average, often without clear explanation. In 1976, a whistleblower exposed that up to 25% of Native American women of childbearing age had been sterilized in the preceding years. In California, prisons reports in the 2000s revealed that dozens of incarcerated women were sterilized without proper approval. As late as 2013, the role of institutions. These sterilization programs were supported by influential organizations and funders, some of the same foundations that had once financed eugenics research in the early 1900s, quietly funded public health programs that blurred the line between choice and control. Academic institutions published research papers that framed sterilization as cost-effective. State agencies tracked compliance, and few, if any, were ever held accountable. This wasn't driven by cruelty, it was driven by ideology and convenience, a quiet erasure. There were no headlines, no mass protests, only empty futures, sealed in operating rooms. Some victims only discovered the truth years later, when they tried to start families and learned they'd been surgically altered without their knowledge. Others never found out. The world remembers what Nazi Germany did, but few remember that in the decades before, the United States sterilized more people in silence. And far from being condemned, these policies were admired. By one man in particular. He read their laws, he studied their reports, and he asked, what if we went further? Chapter 4. Nazi Germany, Eugenics taken to its final form. In the 1930s, Germany was rebuilding, economically, politically, ideologically. But underneath the reconstruction was an idea borrowed from abroad. Not just nationalism, not just racism, eugenics. And while Nazi Germany would later be remembered for the horror of its crimes, many of its earliest policies were modeled on American law. Learning from the West. In speeches and in writing, Nazi leaders openly referenced the United States as a model of racial hygiene, pointing specifically to sterilization laws passed in California, Virginia, and beyond. American textbooks were translated into German. U.S. court rulings were cited as precedent. Foundations and researchers who had promoted eugenics in the West were studied carefully. Eugenics wasn't seen as extremist, it was seen as scientific. Germany's first sterilization law, passed in 1933, was called the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. The targets. Under this law, anyone with a diagnosed mental or physical disability could be sterilized by state order. The criteria included intellectual disabilities, schizophrenia and epilepsy, blindness or deafness, chronic alcoholism, and ambiguous diagnoses like antisocial behavior. Over the next decade, more than 400,000 people were forcibly sterilized under the program. Many were institutionalized, others were simply deemed unfit after brief evaluations. Children were included. These procedures were carried out by licensed medical professionals. Hospitals became centers of control. The shift from sterilization to elimination. By 1939, sterilization was no longer seen as sufficient. A new policy was introduced, initially for children born with severe disabilities. Doctors and midwives were ordered to report infants with certain conditions. Parents were told their child was being taken to a special clinic for care. Instead, many never saw them again. This secretive operation was called Action T4. At first, children were the focus, but over time, the scope expanded to include adults. Patients were transported to treatment centers. There they were subjected to lethal injections, deliberate starvation, and in some cases, early versions of gas chambers, all under medical supervision, all documented in ledgers and charts. By 1945, over 275,000 people, most with disabilities, had been killed through this program. The ideology behind it was chillingly simple: that some lives were worth less than others, that resources were too scarce, that the future must be carefully managed. Action T4 was not only about killing, it was a testing ground for methods later scaled up during the Holocaust, selling it to the public. Of course, such policies couldn't be carried out in total secrecy, so the government launched a campaign to justify them. Posters asked, "Would you rather build schools or support the feeble-minded?" One patient cost as much as 5 workers. Propaganda films portrayed euthanasia as merciful, a public good. The language was clean, the messaging was careful, but the goal was always the same: eliminate perceived burdens, from disability to ethnicity. Once the framework of eugenics had been normalized, it extended outward. Jews, Roma, Slavs, and others were labeled as biologically dangerous, not just culturally, but genetically. If some people could be sterilized for mental defect, others, it was argued, could be removed for racial impurity. Gas chambers were scaled up. Transportation systems were built for efficiency. Entire families were erased, not through battlefield conquest, but through bureaucratic infrastructure. After the war, lessons unlearned. When the war ended, the world was horrified. The trials at Nuremberg exposed atrocities beyond imagination. But while the death camps were condemned, the underlying ideology that populations must be managed was not fully discarded. Many doctors involved in sterilization programs returned to civilian life. Some scientists continued their research under different titles, and the global conversation quietly shifted from racial purity to sustainable development. Chapter 5. The post-war rebrand: population control goes global. The world saw what unchecked eugenics had led to in Nazi Germany. The sterilizations, the exterminations, the numbers tattooed into skin, and the global response: a public rejection of racism, a denouncement of genocide, and a quiet repackaging of the very same ideas. Because the goal, controlling who is born and how many, didn't vanish. It simply changed its clothes. A shift in language, not logic. After World War II, the word eugenics became politically toxic. So institutions began using new terms: family planning, population policy, sustainable development. It wasn't about eliminating inferior stock anymore. It was about helping the planet, helping the poor, helping women make informed decisions. But behind the new slogans, many of the same goals, funders, and methods persisted. A global stage for a familiar agenda. In the 1950s and 60s, Western powers grew anxious. Former colonies were gaining independence. Birth rates were booming in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And population experts began warning of a coming catastrophe: too many people, not enough resources. A new narrative emerged. If poor countries grew too fast, they might face unrest, famine, or even revolution. To maintain stability and global control over food, fuel, and trade, population growth in the global south needed to be managed. The institutions behind the movement, major global organizations, stepped in to lead the charge. The United Nations, the World Bank, USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and philanthropic foundations with deep pockets and deep influence. These groups funded programs around the world to promote contraceptive access and reduce birth rates, often framed as humanitarian aid. And in many cases, the intention may have been good. But in execution, these campaigns sometimes crossed the line from choice into coercion. India, the population laboratory. In the 1970s, India became the world's most aggressive site of state-led population control. Under Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and with funding from international partners, the Indian government launched a mass sterilization program. Clinics were set up across the country, quotas were enforced at the local level, incentives were offered, food, money, radios, and in many cases consent was poorly handled or absent entirely. One year alone, 1976, saw over 8 million sterilizations, mostly of poor and rural citizens. Some individuals were sterilized in school buildings, temples, and tents under conditions that led to thousands of complications and deaths. The global response? Mild criticism, but continued funding. China, one child, no exceptions. In 1979, China introduced the one-child policy, a state-enforced limit on family size that would shape the nation for decades. With support from foreign advisors and financial aid from international institutions, China implemented compulsory contraceptive use, widespread sterilizations and abortions, penalties for unauthorized births, and, in some regions, severe social pressure or force. Over the next 30 years, it's estimated that hundreds of millions of births were prevented. The demographic effects were profound. Skewed gender ratios, aging populations, and long-term economic fallout. Still, the policy was hailed in some circles as a success, a model of population control done right. Africa, the ongoing push. In recent decades, attention has turned to Africa, now seen by some institutions as the world's fastest-growing population. Efforts have included contraceptive distribution programs, long-acting implants, mobile sterilization clinics, and incentives offered to local governments for participation. While many of these initiatives are framed as voluntary, some field reports have raised ethical concerns. Villagers not fully understanding the procedures, social pressure to meet quotas, access to food or health services linked to reproductive decisions. Once again, the line between support and control becomes blurred. The slogans have changed, the methods are cleaner, but the message remains: too many people, too fast, and not the right kind. And while the world applauds progress, the people most affected, poor women, indigenous families, rural communities, are often left unheard. In Chapter 6, Coerced and Forgotten, the victims speak. Population control programs have always been explained in official terms: public health, empowerment, global aid. But for millions of people, especially women in marginalized communities, those words didn't mean freedom. They meant loss of choice, of family, of a future they didn't agree to surrender. These aren't distant horrors from the past. They're stories from the last few decades, some still unfolding today. India, quotas over consent. In 2014, in the Indian state of Chhattisgarh, over 80 women were sterilized in a single day at a rural clinic. The procedure was part of a state-run family planning drive. There was no proper sanitation, no post-operative care. Several women developed infections, 13 died. The conditions were so rushed and unsafe that international headlines briefly turned to the case. But the larger system, one that ties government targets to sterilization rates, remained. Women were promised food rations or small cash payments. In many cases, they were not clearly informed of what was being done to them. Some had no access to follow-up care at all. Peru, a silent operation. Between 1996 and 2000, the government of Peru launched a campaign to reduce poverty by reducing birth rates, especially in indigenous communities. Health workers visited remote villages offering free checkups and treatments. In practice, many women were given sterilization procedures without fully understanding the risks or the permanence. Some were pressured with threats of losing state assistance. Others were told the procedure was required for medical treatment. Several testimonies describe waking up from unrelated procedures, unable to conceive. An estimated 270,000 women were sterilized. To this day, many of them still seek justice and recognition of what was taken from them. United States, a quiet domestic pattern. Even after World War II, forced and coerced sterilizations continued within the U.S. Native American women. In the 1970s, a whistleblower exposed that up to 1 in 4 Native American women of childbearing age had been sterilized, often during visits to Indian Health Service clinics. Some didn't realize what had been done until years later. Some were told it was necessary after giving birth. In many cases, full informed consent was not documented. Black and Latina women. In southern states, black women were sometimes sterilized after childbirth under a procedure nicknamed the Mississippi appendectomy. In California, dozens of Latina women reported being pressured into sterilization in public hospitals throughout the 1960s and 70s. Some were asked to sign forms in English, a language they didn't speak fluently, during moments of stress and vulnerability, like labor. Incarcerated women. Recent reports. From 2006 to 2010, reports from California state prisons revealed that more than 140 women were sterilized without proper authorization or oversight. Some were told the procedures were medically necessary. Others were offered the surgery during labor, without being fully informed of the consequences. A later investigation found that these procedures were often carried out without meeting legal or ethical standards. In one interview, a former inmate said, "If I had known I couldn't have kids, I never would have agreed." Africa, conditional aid and quiet pressure. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, international aid programs have promoted long-term contraceptives and sterilizations as part of global development. These programs are often described as voluntary, but multiple field reports suggest that information is sometimes incomplete or confusing. Medical risks are underexplained. Incentives, such as food, schooling, or access to clinics, may be tied to reproductive choices. In one account from Uganda, a mother claimed she received an injectable contraceptive during a vaccination appointment, without being told what it was or how long it would last. The common pattern. These stories span continents and decades, but the pattern remains disturbingly consistent. Women with limited resources, communities with limited education access, populations deemed too large or too poor, and systems that prioritize quotas over consent. Most of these women were not given a choice. Many were not given information, and very few were ever given an apology. For those affected, the physical pain faded, but the psychological wound remained. The knowledge that someone else decided their family should end. Chapter 7. Modern Echoes. The Fear of Too Many Humans. The sterilization campaigns of the 20th century may have slowed, but the mindset behind them has quietly survived, evolving with new language, new tools, and new urgency. Today, population control isn't branded with force. It's marketed with climate graphics, TED Talks, and algorithms. And it's no longer just about who shouldn't reproduce. Now it's about whether human reproduction itself is a risk to the planet. Population panic rebranded. In the decades since World War II, concern about global birth rates shifted away from overt eugenics and into the realm of environmentalism. The logic took on a new shape. More people means more consumption. More consumption leads to resource depletion, therefore fewer people, sustainability. From think tanks to non-profit organizations, this belief quietly took hold. If humanity wanted to survive, it needed to slow down its own growth. But just like before, the conversation often centered around who exactly needed to slow down. Influence from the top prominent philanthropists and public figures have voiced concern over population growth, particularly in the developing world. Many have supported programs aimed at expanding access to contraception and reproductive education, especially in regions experiencing rapid demographic change. These efforts are often framed as empowerment, and in many cases, they are. But critics have raised concerns about how these efforts are implemented and whether all communities are truly making informed choices. One famous TED Talk quote sparked years of debate. If we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, and reproductive health services, we could lower the population by 10 to 15%. Bill Gates, 2010. While the quote referred to reducing population growth rates through improved public health, it was interpreted by some as suggesting that health tools could or should be used to limit population size. Climate change, a new moral justification. In recent years, population concerns have merged with climate anxiety. Documentaries, social media campaigns, and public figures have begun linking personal reproduction with environmental impact. Phrases like carbon footprint of a child, eco-conscious family planning, climate justice through fewer births, have moved from the margins into mainstream discussions. Young people report choosing not to have children out of fear for the planet's future. Others are praised for sacrificing family life to help reduce emissions. This isn't coercion by law, it's cultural pressure disguised as virtue, and the result is often the same: a reduction in human reproduction, framed as the ethical thing to do. Technology enters the equation. Meanwhile, the tools of the 21st century have changed the landscape completely. AI and big data systems now help governments and organizations track fertility trends, predict birth rates, and plan resource distribution. Some governments tie social benefits, access to services, or education subsidies to participation in reproductive programs. And gene editing technologies like CRISPR raise new questions. Will future societies favor certain genetic traits over others? Could access to reproduction become tied to genetic desirability? What happens when algorithms, not humans, decide what's optimal? These questions no longer belong to science fiction. Voluntary or conditioned? Today, most global population efforts are framed as voluntary, and in many regions they truly are. But in some cases, the choices are influenced by economic pressure, lack of full information, or social conditioning. A woman in a rural village may accept a long-term implant without understanding its duration. A young couple in a city may feel guilty for wanting children in a world that warns against it. A government might prioritize contraception access while neglecting maternal care or child support. The pressure isn't loud, it's quiet. It's embedded in policy, in culture, in expectation. A self-regulating system, perhaps the most unsettling development. Many people now choose smaller families or no families at all, not because of direct intervention, but because they've internalized the idea that they themselves are the problem. This is the final evolution of population control, when it no longer needs clinics or coercion, because the belief is already installed. You don't need a law to reduce the population. You only need an idea, one that makes people question whether they deserve to continue. Chapter 8. The question they won't let you ask. For decades, the world has been asking how to manage people, but rarely, if ever, have we stopped to ask why. Population control has worn many masks: science, charity, health, progress. And yet, the outcomes often look the same. Quiet clinics in forgotten towns, medical forms signed under pressure, empty cradles where generations were meant to begin. So maybe the question we need to ask now isn't how many people is too many, but something far more uncomfortable. What was this all really about? Power, not numbers. Throughout history, population concerns have always followed the same trajectory. First comes scarcity panic, not enough food, space, or jobs. Then come the targets, always the poor, the rural, the voiceless. And finally comes the solution, reduce them for everyone's good. But the world has never truly lacked the resources to feed or house billions. It's lacked the will to share them. That's the part rarely mentioned, because it reframes the issue. Maybe overpopulation was never the root problem. Maybe inequality was. And managing birth rates became the shortcut, the easier fix. A history written without consent. From Victorian poorhouses to sterilization camps, from post-war policies to modern algorithms, one thread remains. The people being managed were almost never asked. Not the women in Peru, not the teens in US institutions, not the villagers in India, not the mothers in tribal lands. Their futures were planned for them and then forgotten. Their names were turned into case numbers, their families into cautionary statistics, and their voices into silence. The cleanest control is psychological. The 21st century has changed tactics. Now there's no need for surgical quotas or government decrees. All that's needed is the right narrative. That humans are a strain on the earth. That parenting is irresponsible. That choosing not to reproduce is enlightened. And so people voluntarily step back. They delay families or cancel them altogether. Not from coercion, but from internalized fear. When population control becomes an idea you adopt yourself, it doesn't need enforcement. It becomes a belief, almost a religion. The silent design. As birth rates fall across developed countries, a new dilemma appears. Who remains? Which cultures shrink? Which ones grow? And who, ultimately, is shaping that trajectory? Is this just social evolution? Or is it something more deliberate? A result of who has access, who has influence, and who sets the terms. Because the people funding global policy, designing AI-driven planning tools, and influencing cultural trends don't usually live in the same neighborhoods as those whose lives are most affected by them. So here's the question they won't let you ask. What if population control, at its core, was never about protecting the earth, but about controlling who gets to inherit it? An inconvenient truth. For over a century, the people with the power to shape society have consistently focused on limiting those they feared. The poor, the colonized, the disabled, the unfit, the overly fertile. That pattern doesn't change just because the vocabulary did. You can call it sustainability. You can call it equity, you can call it progress, but if it's always the same people being discouraged, disincentivized, or quietly erased, then it's time to ask if the story we've been told is complete, or if something deeper has been hidden beneath the surface all along. Because maybe the real problem wasn't the size of the population. It was the idea that some people counted more than others, and maybe the real crisis isn't overpopulation. It's engineered extinction.